Greetings, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar with Exostar. Uh, it's titled Easy and Affordable How to Build Audit-Ready Policies for DoD Assessments. This is key to everything related to CMMC as well as uh, things related to 171 as well. Our guest today is Sean Fornwalt, and we'll get into introductions in a minute, and I'm Scott Armstrong. For the agenda today, we'll have introductions. I'll go through some housekeeping rules as well on the next slide. Then I'm going to pass it over to Sean, and he'll do a demo of Policy Pro and also walk through specifically how to build out your documentation to be aligned with 171 requirements and things of that nature. We're going to follow by moderated Q&A. I'll be asking the questions, and Sean and I will probably be doing the answers. And these will be based upon pre-submitted questions that we've gotten from the audience. Then we'll also conclude with an exit poll as well. We'd like to get feedback from these sessions so that we can better plan for the next ones and keep the content relevant as well and keep the information flowing and serving a real need to the community. So from a housekeeping perspective, the webinar is scheduled to last about 45 minutes to an hour, including Q&A. We typically always try to cut it off right at the hour to keep it crisp if we need to. All participants will be muted just so that we can speak and present without interruption as well. A large portion of this session is going to be dedicated to answering the questions submitted from the audience in advance, and we'll be answering those. If there's questions that we can't get to, or if you've got new questions that come up, or if there is something specific to do, you can always feel free to reach out to us at cmmc-team@exostar.com. We've got a live chat feature on our corporate website that you can also ping us with questions as well, and we'll always try to address them the best way that we can. For your convenience, there's a link in the YouTube description to a glossary of commonly used terms and acronyms. Unfortunately, there's a lot of acronyms related to all this, and that's where, we've been living and breathing this stuff, but not everybody has, so we want to have that available to you. This webinar is also going to be recorded, will be available on demand after the event, and it's going to be in the Exostar resource library. And in case of an outage, and we haven't had this happen to date, just please wait for a minute and refresh the page and everything should be good. One thing I want to mention, you can use your Policy Pro trial for today's event. If you don't have access to one, you can get the link right now in the YouTube description. It takes about 2 minutes to sign up with an email, etc., and you can get right in. And if you want to, you can follow along with what Sean's going to be doing in the demo. Now, here today, I'm Scott Armstrong, Senior Director for our Risk Applications here at Exostar. Sean Fornwalt is with a partner of ours, ISMS Applications. They are the software authors of Policy Pro, and he's considered a subject matter expert in things related to IT policies, use of Policy Pro, as well as how it relates to compliance for 171 and also the CMMC requirements. Sean, at this point, I'll hand it over to you. If you want to take control, then you can go right into the demo and the discussion on your front for Policy Pro.
All right, will do. Thank you very much, Scott. So as Scott was saying, my name is Sean Fornwalt. I am the Director of Client Technical Support and the Data Protection Officer for ISMS Applications. And as Scott had said, we partnered with EXO to build a platform with software to enable DoD contractors to more easily and more accessibly build out their cybersecurity compliance documentation for both the 800-171 and the CMMC standards. Now, one note that I always like to make up front is that you can start in either of these two standards. If you're currently under a DFARS contract, you will need to have your 800-171 compliance, but all 110 of those controls directly map over to the 130 in CMMC. So if you start with the NIST and you can get everything in there good to go, you've already got a vast majority of your level 3 CMMC taken care of. So the first thing that we're going to do when we come into the platform from logging in is that we're going to log in and it's going to ask us to pick a platform. Now, for today's demonstration, we're going to be going through the 800-171 because that is the current law of the land on cybersecurity compliance. So we're just going to select this and then continue through. This is not a binding choice, however, you are able to freely go between the two different standards on the platform, and that can be found on the left-hand side over here with the corresponding button for the other standard. So I'm currently in the 800-171. I can click on the CMMC, and I will jump over to that standard instead, and I can just jump right back by clicking on the button again. So the first thing when you come into the platform is that you will see this where it says the dashboard will populate once you use policy assessment. All this means is that you haven't uploaded any documentation to be assessed against our learners. So you have a couple of choices here. If you have documentation, whether it's complete or piecemeal, you can upload it to get an assessment on it according to its policy family. Or you can jump into our policy builder and you can start putting together a larger policy document using one of our templates. So in the trial version of Policy Pro, you do have access to the access control document where you can go through and write out and work on 22 of the 110 controls and then export that document out to be assessed later through the policy assessment. So we're going to go under the assumption that you have no documentation written at this point in time. So we're going to come over here into our policy builder, and then we're going to select the policy family that we want to work with. So for this example, we'll be going to 3.1 or access control. And now each of our policy families will start you out in Policy Builder with a prepare, a gather, and a consult phase. And what these are is that it's getting you ready to walk in and start working on the documentation and giving in the prepare phase a real high level overview of what we're going to be covering. Next, under our gather, we have a list of documents that you may already possess. And again, this is not an exclusive list. You may have other documents that will be helpful in answering these questions of compliance as we're writing our policy. And then our last part of this is our consult, because we understand as a company that IT security and cybersecurity on a larger scale is not purely an IT department issue. It's a whole of business issue. Because as a policy writer within my company, I can write any policy I want, but if the entire company doesn't adhere to it, it really lacks value in keeping the company's resources and intellectual property safe. So we know that you're not going to be the only person in your organization that has the answers, and we're giving you some insight into who you would want to talk to during the process of policy creation. Once we've gone through this and we have a grasp on what we're going to be doing, what we need to get together and who we need to talk to, we're going to jump right in and get started. So this is our policy builder where we have the different sections of the policy broken down to make it a more manageable way of writing your policy. And it's also easier to understand it when you only have to work at it one or two pieces at a time. First things first, though, we have up here, this organization name is populated by when you set up your account, and this will then intersperse your company name where appropriate throughout the template document. So as you can see, we have ISMS solutions right here, and then throughout the document, we have it where appropriate in the other pieces of the policy. Next, we have our department. This is the responsible department for enforcing this particular policy. And in this case, it's information technology. In your case, it may be different. You can change this to whatever it may be. And then once you click out of it, it will save it. The next thing that we want to make sure that we're doing is setting an issue date. This helps us to keep track of when this particular document is current from. So we want to go ahead and select the date that we're actually going to be issuing or exporting this document. We'll then have the individual who is responsible for the approval of this document and then a tracking number that can be anything or in any convention so that it matches how you keep track of records. So once we have all this done, this will come out in the export in the Word document at the top in a table to help you keep track of, some important pieces on the document itself. But into the actual meat and potatoes now, we have a couple of things that we have to identify when we're writing a policy. And primarily, we have to say, why are we writing a policy or determine a purpose for the document? And this can seem a little pedantic to have to explain and say, I'm writing this policy because I have to. Really, what you want to do in your purpose is you're saying that we as a company understand that having proper cyber hygiene and being responsible about our resources and assets is beneficial to not only ourselves, but our trading partners, our country at large, and everyone else that we interact with. So we're saying this is why we're putting this in the forefront and why we're taking it as a serious task to write policy about it. The next thing that we need to identify is we need to identify the scope of this particular document and what is it going to cover and who has to adhere to it. Because if I just write an access control policy and I don't identify that it covers everyone in the organization, someone could turn around and say, well, I didn't think I had to do that because I wasn't identified in the scope. So we provide some template language in here that will cover everyone that uses your IT resources or the company's IT resources. And you can change this however you want by clicking on either case. We have this little circle with the white pencil in it. You can click on that. It will bring up a text editor and you can make any changes that you want to make to it right here. And then you'll save this and then it will be kept. And we'll just do this for now. So we see that there are changes and we will save it. And then you can see that it does put it right here and it will export with this new information or new verbiage that we're putting in. So now that we've explained the reason why we're writing this document, we're explaining what and who it covers, we need to get into the actual requirements or the controls of 800-171. So what we've done with Policy Pro is that we've taken and broken them down into smaller groups as to how they relate to each other. So in the case of 3.1.1 and point 2 derives from point 1, so they're put together in a group. Now, we also put out the exact language from the standard itself, so you don't have to be flipping back and forth between the standard and the policy builder. You can see all the information in front of you at one time. Now, what we have as well is we do provide some high-level guidelines as to what each of the individual controls is covering and what we should be including in that particular language. Again, we can open up the text editor with the same icon on the right-hand side here. We'll click on that and it will pop up with two individual text boxes that we can edit independently. And we can also click on this double-sided arrow to expand it out and make it larger. So we can play around with this. We can make it bigger. We can zoom in. 1 second here. Decided to lose it. There we go. So we can make this bigger. We can turn it around. We can put bulleted lists. We can do a number of things, but this is a limited text editor. There's not a lot of the functionality that you'll have in a true word processor. So if that is the case, you would want to export the template language and then work on it in a Word document format on your local system. But we can go through here, we can look and see, all these different parts of our access control policy. And in the first one, we're looking at our account creation procedure, right? Because our first control is telling us that we have to identify all of our authorized users, as well as any processes or devices that they use. So the first thing we want to do is, how do we create an account? What is the procedure that we do it the same way every time? Now, we do provide some very high-level sample language on this. Each individual organization will differ not only in the process that they go through, but also with the software that they're using. So if you're using Windows, you may primarily be using Active Directory, but even within that, you may be using Azure, or maybe you have GCC High where you're using, you know, well, again, you'd be using Azure with that, but you're using a different software. There's a different process, there's different levels. And, you also have the human resources aspect. Do people have to go through background checks? Do they have to take tests? What do they have to do in order to gain access to your system? And that will all vary based on your organization and what you do. Because obviously, if you work as an asphalt paver versus you make microchips, the processes that you go through and what you do in your organization will vary vastly. So we've given you the wire form where you can really build out and identify everything that you want to do from what we have here, and you will have a good starting point in building your own policy. So once we do that, we can go ahead and hit the save button here. That will create a timestamp of the last time that it was edited. You can keep track of who was in there and at what time and day in a general sense, right? It does work off of the Greenwich Mean Time, so you will have to adjust that for your particular time zone. Now, as we're going through this, I am going to export this out and we're going to look at it in a Word document outside of the platform because in my professional policy writing, I prefer to do it that way, but you can do it either way. You can work in the policy builder, you can pull it out and work in Word. It doesn't really matter as long as you're writing the policy, because this is going to establish the rules of how your company does things when it comes to your cyber assets or your information assets. Now, what we're looking at here, when I go to export a document from Policy Builder, it will tell me that I have not made changes to the following controls. This is fine because I don't have to make the changes in the platform, but it is giving you a heads up that this is still purely template language that you want to go in and customize. So we're going to hit the yes. It will pop it out into my default browser download folder, and I'll just be able to click on that and open it up in my local Word program. There we go. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is that this file will always come in a read-only format, so you will need to enable editing in order to make any changes to the document itself. So we'll just there. And then we will zoom in so everyone can see what we're working on. And as we can see, we do have all the information that we put in on top of the policy builder is in this table at the top, so we can keep track of exactly when this document was written. And now the reason why we want to keep track of when this particular document is written is one of the requirements of cybersecurity policy that a lot of people seem to overlook is that you have to continually go back and review your documentation to ensure that you're covering all the necessary items. Because one of the things that's always been certain about cybersecurity is that the threats change. Not only do we have new threats that emerge, we have old threats that evolve and change the way that they interact between different systems. One of those things that we just recently had was the solar winds hack or the solar winds incident that happened in the last half of 2020, where a software developer update patch, which typically is trusted as being clean and not having issues associated with it, was actually contained. It was injected with malware that opened up backdoors and allowed breaches into several federal agencies as well as some other high profile companies because they installed this update patch trusting it because it's from the developer, and somehow someone had worked and put a malware virus inside of it that then caused, a massive data breach. So now we have to reconfigure and realign how we approach update patches, because you can't simply trust them because they're coming from the developer. You now have to sandbox it. You have to, put it into a proper testing environment before you implement. So you'll always have to be making changes to approach the threats that you face, in your theater of operation. So that's why we want to make sure that we're keeping track of when a particular document is issued, when it is approved, and so on. But as we can see here, we bring all that information together for you, and there are a couple extra spaces that you can add in your own information should you need to. But as we saw in the policy builder, we have this structured out by identifying the particular policy family. We put in our purpose, which is our reason why we're writing this particular document. Again, you will want to make changes to this to adapt it to your organization's mission, function, and goals. Next, we have our scope, where we're just talking about, again, the what and the who. What is it covering? Who has to adhere to it? And you want to be as explicit as possible here, because, again, in the event of an incident, you can't assign blame if someone was not in the scope of a policy. So you have to say, any user on our system has to do things this way, which is essentially at the very base level what a policy is to be. It's the rules of operation within your organization. So by setting those ground rules, making them not, achievable goals, because you don't want to make them so strict that they can't be adhered to and still be productive as a business. But next we have, like I said, our first one. We provide in the document itself the precise language from the standard. This way that when you're going through it, you're not, going back and forth. You might get confused or, mix stuff up. We put it there right for you. And also, because we worked with auditors in the space to figure out the best way to set up these policies, you're addressing this one particular control in its entirety before you're moving on to the next. So the auditor, in the event that you may face an audit, doesn't have to read your policy document and then dissect it and try to figure out what covers what within the standard. We're saying, here's everything we're going to do to cover this control. It's all contained right here. It's in black and white language. You can see it. And then that could, I can't guarantee this because it will depend on the auditor, but it could speed the audit process up. Instead of it being several weeks, it could take a couple fewer days. And if you get repetitive, that's okay, right? If I'm addressing something in account creation, and then I'm going to be touching on it again in one of the other 109 controls, that's okay, because you can. Because further down in access control, we start talking about strong passwords and, unsuccessful login limitations and, multi-factor authentication. All these things are very similar, and they will have some crossover, but that's good, because that means that you're covering every possible angle where you might have a vulnerability. And that's essentially what we want to do. We want to set up a multi-wall set of protections to keep our information safe as an organization, and to protect the CUI information that we're getting from the DoD, because that will affect our warfighters in the future if it is stolen, which is why it's so important that we do this process and write the documentation. If you use Policy Pro, it's an excellent tool that can help you through that process. And then you can transition over to Certification Assistant, which is another product that Exostar offers that will help you through the implementation process of taking the theoretical from the policy and making it into the actual of the implementation. So once I've gone ahead and I've done all this work and I've written my policy, how do I know if it's any good? The way that we have it set up on the system is that you can work on your policy, and then you can assess your policy with our policy assessment. Now, you will see that this has logged me out twice. We do have a 15-minute timeout on this, so if you need to walk away and there's 15 minutes of inactivity, it will sign you out and you'll have to sign back in. So we'll go back in here, we'll make sure we're still in the same standard. And now we're going to go over here and we're going to look at our policy assessment. So we make sure that we're looking at access control because that's what we're working with. We're going to upload a document, which will open up our load queue, where we'll attach a document to it, select the one that we want. Let's go to the proper one. And then we'll pull in the document that we want to assess and hit submit. And now what our system is doing is it's running it through our backend algorithms and through our expert learning to assess the relevance of the document that's been uploaded. Under our scoring metrics, the 69.5 that this returned is in the good range. It's not an academic score, so above a 50% is considered in the good range. It's saying that it's covering most or a majority of the necessary items to be in line with the standard. We also have the model similarity where it's saying, this looks an awful lot like our template. You may want to customize it more, but it doesn't negatively affect your score. Same thing with word count. If it's too short, it's saying you're not going to cover access control in 500 words. So you may want to go in and add some more meat to the bones so that you're covering everything adequately. Again, does not negatively affect your score. Those are just markers of saying, we noticed these couple of things. You may want to go back and address them. Now, the score is great. It tells me I'm in a good range, but it doesn't give me the nuanced answers of what I might be missing. And we've thought of that, and what we're going to look at now is our Kenny system, or our key elements not included. So our Kenny system is set up that it will go through the document that's being assessed and say, are we finding it or are we not? And we do have two different types. We have our general policy Kennies, which are key terms and phrases that are typically found in a document of this type and are recommended to be included. They don't have any direct correlation to the standard itself, but it's something that you may want to go back and address. Now, the other ones are our control-specific Kennies. And the way that those work is that these tie directly into a specific part of each of the policy families and to the standard itself. So in the case of CUI and non-public information, this directly correlates to the 1.22 or the control CUI posted or processed on publicly accessible systems. In a nutshell, what this means is that you will not put CUI on Facebook and other social media, on YouTube, or anything like that, because it's supposed to be protected information. You would not release it to the public through one of those channels. However, as we see in the discussion, it goes into more depth as to why this is the case and what we may need to have in place in order to address this. More importantly, it's coming up and saying, we don't find this in your document. Go back and make sure that you're covering it. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into our document as we were working on it, and we're going to look for the 0.22. So as you can see, we have here, now this would ideally be my company name. So we'll just put ISMS for now. And here's what we're doing as a company about CUI on publicly accessible systems. We're designating an individual that posted. All information being posted on any publicly accessible network or system has to go through this person or this team of people who are authorized to do it. There has to be appropriate training for these people. We have to have reviews of what content is being posted there and what is currently posted there. And we're putting in all these safeguards to make sure that we're not going to be putting CUI onto a publicly facing network. So why did I get the Kenny? The Kenny is looking very specifically for the phrase non-public information. I didn't have that verbiage in my document, So it popped it saying, we didn't see this, but we want to make sure that you go back and ensure that you're covering the concept of what this phrase represents. And the reason why this happens is that each individual organization will be approaching it differently, right? If you're a 5-person company, you will be approaching this in a very different way than a 20,000 employee company. You'll have different resources available, you have different expertise, you will be addressing it differently. However, you both may be using Policy Pro, so we make the scoring work for both by saying we're not noticing it. Please go back and make sure you're covering it. And if you feel that you've adequately covered it, you've done your research, you understand what is required of you, you can say, I've covered this, I can move on to the next. You may also come to the conclusion that I didn't cover it, I completely missed it, but I don't know what to do, right? I don't know where to find information to figure this out. Now, what we also have is we do have the documents for examination. Again, it's a list of documents you may have that you can look to for the answers to these questions. Additionally, we provide a reference library that is a collection of different documents and standards that will help to educate yourself as to what you need to do in order to learn what needs to be covered under the requirement. Now, I know I am running a little bit short on time, Scott, so I'm just going to hit through this and we'll go into that Q&A because I do want to get to those questions. Very quickly, what our reference library is set up to do is that you select the particular control family you're working on. You will click on it and it will give you a list of relevant documents to that particular, I keep trying to call it a domain because that's what it's under CMMC, that particular policy family. You can then click on this 800 series of documents that are all from the NIST organization, and they will help to educate you as to what NIST expects for their particular standard. So we can go ahead and we can click on that document or that link. It will take us directly to the nist.gov site. We do not post any of these on our site. They're all on the nist.gov site to, maintain their integrity and their authenticity. And then you can go ahead and open up that document, go directly to the section that you need, learn what you have to know to answer your immediate question, put it in your policy, and then move on. And then you go through and you re-upload your document to reassess it after you've gone through and addressed your Kennys, and then you get a sense of, the document's getting better. And, again, you may not be an expert in writing policy, but you really can use this tool to help you learn what you need to know to make that decision for your organization. But with that, again, if you have any more questions, like Scott said, you can send it to the emails provided, and we will get to those at a later time. So Scott, hand it back over and we can go into those Q&As.
Thanks, Sean. That was excellent. Before we go on to the Q&A, I just want to remind people for the exit poll. You can do it at the end of the session or you can do it now. The link is down in the YouTube description. That is very important for us to get feedback just so we can help make these useful for everyone going forward, and we appreciate that. To go directly into the Q&A, let me pull up some of our questions that we've got. The first question that I've got, and this I believe is related to CMMC assessments. It could be a 171 assessment, but it's asking, are these assessments necessary for selling COTS hardware like our 3D printers, even if they're operating standalone or off network? Do you have thoughts on that, Sean? And I might have a thought or two after you.
Yeah, I mean, on 3D printers specifically, it comes down to what kind of data is kept on board. I mean, is the CUI strictly on a removable drive? Is it on the onboard drive? Is it connected to a network? But typically, from what I've gotten from talking with C3PAOs, is that even if you're selling something that is COTS or commercial off the shelf, if you make any specific change to that in a configuration, in some kind of software update that is covered under a contract that is DFARS, then it is applicable under CUI for that particular software update or configuration applied.
Agreed, agreed. Now, I'll add in there, if you're selling these things directly into the DoD, then if you're doing those transactions on a contract where you're getting federal contract information that's not publicly known, that's called FCI. And for that, you do need a CMMC Maturity Level 1 certification when they're available. So that's another nuance. If you're selling your hardware through resellers and they're doing that, you might not need to. So it gets back to, is there a CUI because of modifications you're doing, or are you selling direct and having federal contract information?
Right.
Um, all right, so here's a question. So does my company need to have 171 compliance to get CMMC level 3, or must we have uh, the additional 20 controls from CMMC implemented before getting certified? You want to do your take on that one, Sean?
So I would say yes, but I do know that there was some talk about some kind of reciprocity, but because they've included the 110 in the 130 for level 3, those other 20 would be required, especially because the major difference between the old 171 prior to the Spurs update was that the CMMC is a go no go. You're either 100% or you're nothing. So you do want to have those other 20 in. And I mean, in a sense, you've already done 110 of 130. It's just another 20 things. So but again, because it's a go no go, I would absolutely say you'd have to have the other 20.
Yeah. And I know the government sometimes uses the term crawl, walk, run with the whole transition to CMMC. And with the term 171 compliance, we'll call out there specifically, you technically can be 171 compliant if you've implemented a control, or if it's not implemented, you have a plan of action, a milestone to have it implemented. Now, if you have those plan of actions and milestones on a control that's not implemented, you'll never get a CMMC certification because, as Sean mentioned, it's go, no go. You have to have it all implemented. So what I would say is make sure your 171 controls get 100% implemented, and that's part of your journey into getting ready for a CMMC certification with the additional 20 controls and practices and things of that nature. And that relates to what was Sean referred to as a SPRS score, or there's a thing called the SPRS system, Supplier Performance and Risk Management System, that the government has, where you need to upload your DoD assessment methodology score, which ties directly to 171 today. Now, here's a question that I've got, and it might be more related to certification assistant, but here it is. How do I find my score and upload it? And Sean, I'll take this one first because
Okay.
the score, if you are part of the Exostar community, you might be inputting your scores for 171 on a per control basis into an application we call the Partner Information Manager. And that particular application has got a flat scoring system. So when you implement all 110 controls, you get a score of like 110, 100% completion rate. The score that goes into the SPRS system is based upon a DoD assessment methodology. It's at version, I think, 1.03. They've published it. It's out there, and it's risk weighted on a per control basis, so that if you don't have a control implemented, you can have up to a -5 assigned to you. So your range of scores, if you have got nothing implemented, could be a -205 to a perfect score of 110. So to find this score, you have to go and there's a published methodology that the DoD has. You have to look at your implementation status and some other nuances for a few things like multi-factor authentication and FIPS crypto validation status. And you could manually, score yourself with a spreadsheet, et cetera. But what we've got is our sister application of Policy Pro Certification Assistant. Now, what it does, where Policy Pro helps you build and maintain your policies, Certification Assistant helps you do not only your self-assessment, but build and maintain your what's called an SSP, your System Security Plan. And that's a key artifact that's needed just like your policies to be able to go through any audit, whether it's for 171 or CMMC. So within that tool, we auto generate a score tied to your system security plan. A lot of people right now might have a negative score because they still have a lot of POEMs in place that they're working to get 171 compliant. So as you update your SSP, you want to be updating your score, and then you take that report and log into the government system. And we've got some links at the end of the slide deck that's got some information about how to go through and get access to that government system. So that's a key thing, and it's just like your policies you need to maintain over time. Same with your system security plan, and those are the key artifacts needed for any assessment to go through with a whether it's a a DoD audit or a CMMC C3PO audit. Uh, here's a question about a small company. So how does a company build a policy? Well, we don't have a facility network or computers. And this like get even into access control and things of that nature. And I'm assuming that there still could be federal contract information or controlled unclassified information that you're in receipt of, even if not received electronically. Sean, do you have thoughts on that one?
Right. I mean, this is a very specific one, so it's hard to comment how this individual case would work. But I would take a step back because if you have people that are working remotely and they're using their own personal devices, those fall under that umbrella now that they have to be considered when you're writing your policy, right? Just because they're not using a company device, if they're processing company information or contract information, then those devices fall under the scope of the requirements. So it comes down to that, I have talked to several smaller companies where, they work on the effect that, like they're a headhunter. They just, they connect primes and contractors, but they don't necessarily handle CUI. They definitely handle FCI because they're working with federal contractors. So they would have to be at least minimum level 1, right? It doesn't matter what level of technology you have, what level of, setup you have. If you do any business with the DoD or a DoD contractor, you have to be level 1 at a minimum. And now that seems a little harsh, right? But level 1 is literally 17 practices that are basic cyber hygiene. I mean, very, very basic stuff. And it's not difficult to do. We have in Policy Pro for CMMC where you can break it down by level and really address each individual level as necessary for you. But again, it really will come down to, just because you don't claim to have company assets doesn't mean that your employees aren't using information assets to do their work.
Excellent. The I've got another question here. And actually, I think you just kind of covered it as well, where uh, this is somebody that works with the DoD. That's their primary customers, and it's primarily sending emails back and forth. And that's where sometimes they include a PDF that's got a sales quote, and they have to send a PDF attachment back with a purchase contract. So they're actually transacting business and sending some of that back over the email. So does that person need a CMMC certification? And it would sound like yes, if it's federal contract information at
Right.
level 1.
That would definitely fall under FCI and would require level 1 certification.
The one thing I'll also mention, not everybody knows this, but there is a current FAR clause that if you do any government contract direct with the government, whether it's civilian or federal, there are specific cybersecurity requirements that you are attesting to today that directly align with CMMC level 1. So the reality is if you're a government contractor, you should already have the technologies employed and practices to be CMMC level 1. You just haven't gone through that certification process. So it's actually not a bad practice to do that as a minimum no matter what.
Right. And the other thing, Scott, that point brings up is that a lot of these things people are already doing. They just don't have it written in policy, right?
Yes.
Because that's one of the other hallmarks of writing a policy document is that you're doing just that. You're saying, this is what we do. And that's the best place to start from, right? You say, this is what we do, this is how we do it. And then you go back and look at it and say, are there any vulnerabilities that this brings to light? Are there any risks that we're not addressing? And then you can build from there. So, I mean, but again, in the case of an audit or a certification process, if you don't have the document, you may as well not have the control in place.
Yeah. And
So,
on that point, Sean, the way you guys have included being able to break it out by CMMC level to include level 1, I think is key. Technically, if you read uh, how CMMC is constructed, you're required for level 2 and above to have IT policies specific by domain to be able to demonstrate that. But in talking to some of the provisional assessors that have gone through the training and whatnot, the two things that they're going to be asking for is all your paperwork evidence that you're doing what you're saying you're doing. If you've got IT policies that align with level 1, that's a checkbox that they want to see right away. And same thing like with the system security plan or implementation statements for those 15 things. If you've got that they can print off, that's another checkbox, because if you don't have that, they're going to be interviewing staff typically, and then they're going to have to test control. So if you don't have documentation about these things, they're going to get invasive, get in your network, and that also turns into a more expensive audit process, at least with how the CMMC regimen is expected to roll out.
right. And that's also the case with level 3 as well, is that there are three different methodologies that the C3PAOs or the assessors are going to use. Like you said, you can show documentation, they can interview personnel, and again, everybody better have the same story, or they can test the actual equipment. They're only required to have two of those three. They don't have to
Yep.
have all three. So the documentation knocks one of those out right away.
All right, so now here's a question. We might not have the perfect answer. I know in some of my webinars with some government officials, I've had them answer it. So if the program is being mandated by the DoD, which it is, are they going to provide any funding for implementation? If so, how do we secure those funds? Uh, I've got some thoughts on that, Sean. I don't know if you want to throw in some thoughts or just have me go through it.
I think I'll let you start because the last I heard anything about that would have been pre-COVID.
Got it.
So,
So I do know people in Congress are trying to figure out how to get resources, especially for SMB, to be able to have grant monies and things like that associated. And sometimes at a state level, there's things going on there as well. It is designed to be an allowable cost, is what they're calling it. So that's where they're saying, build it into your rates or your other structures, which is implying that the general cost of things for the DoD will likely rise a bit, but then it also gets a little tricky where you've still got to be competitive and win business and whatnot. The last session I had with somebody from the Defense Acquisition University uh, had a few specific areas, depending on the types of contracts, where it might get a little tricky. And that could still be an area I think that we could see the DoD evolving a bit to say, how do we better fund uh, cybersecurity for the DIB? And it wouldn't surprise me with our new administration, with the review they're doing, if they're looking at that closely, because there has been testimony that's saying we've got to make sure we keep, small suppliers viable and secure, and how do we do that without undue burden as well. But the key thing is really trying to secure our critical infrastructure, of which our defense industrial base is key.
right, Scott. And the other thing too is, and this was a much earlier change or concession that they made, because originally, I think it was the point two or the point two draft, is that they were saying that you had to be certified to bid. And then they changed it to you have to be certified to be awarded the contract,
Yep.
meaning that you don't have to be certified at the time that you submit your bid. once you know that you've won that bid and you're going to be awarded it, that's your deadline for your certification. But again, it's going to be a gradual implementation till 2025. That doesn't mean we wait until, September of 2024 and then rush to get it done. If you spread the cost out over a longer period, it's not going to cost you any less to do it, but the burden is spread out and you're not as pinched at the time that you're doing it.
Yes, and the more that you can do yourself over time, uh, the more that you can kind of build it into how you're currently staffed versus, trying to hire a consultant to help you get ready in a short time frame before, a certification or a contract's coming out that you want to be part of the bid on. Um,
Well, the other thing there too is that even if you have a consultant write your policies for you, and then you have a contractor implement them, you still have to learn what they are. You have to understand them. But if you write them yourself and you hire the people to implement and maintain it, or you have those people, then you know it on a more intimate level and you understand it, and you can make the adjustments as necessary.
And that gets back to the audit process because they're going to ask for your documentation, then they're going to interview people. And if they're interviewing the people that don't know policies and how they're supposed to be implemented or anything else, you're going to be tripped up right there. So that is a very key point. Um, so here's a question, and I'll take this one. Is Exostar going to be a C3PAO? And the joke around my house is my wife still thinks it's a Star Wars term, but no, that's the certified third-party assessment organizations that are accredited by the accreditation body, the CMMC-AB. And right now, there's a process going on with the DoD where they first do the Defense Management Contracting Agency audit somebody to be able to make sure they're uh, have the controls in place, and then the AB approves it. Exostar specifically is not looking to be a certifying body from that perspective, doing those assessments. We do, though, have a significant partner program where we're working with consulting firms and people that are skilled in the art and involved in either being a C3PO or being a registered provider organization, and they've got existing staffs and skills around this. And that's where we do have those consultants that work directly with our end customers. We're not in the middle of the transaction. They also have the ability to remotely collaborate within our certification assistant solution, so they can do, readiness assessments or do review your SSP remotely and things of that nature. Some of the firms are listed on our website, and that's where if you reach out to us at cmmc-team@exostar.com, we can also give more specific guidance with, here's the ones that we know that are going down the path or not. I know as of right now, I think the first press release for the one that made it through the gauntlet, as that type of organization just came out earlier today. I know DCMA is quickly going on to additional firms to get them to go through their part of the process before the accreditation body does their approval. So I'm expecting to see additional firms make it through that chute to be able to become a certified third-party organization. I've got a question about the basic assessment. And the basic assessment goes back to the DoD assessment methodology where you're scoring your 171 status. And a basic assessment is where you're doing your own self-assessment. It's a medium assessment when the government asks for your SSP and does their own scoring off of it. And it's a high assessment when they actually the government goes in and does that audit and looks at your other artifacts. They could be on site, but they're going to be reviewing additional evidence and whatnot. But the question was for basic assessment, are most entities doing an enclave by enclave approach? And Sean, you might have some perspectives, but then I can give some as well with what I have been hearing just from the customers that I've been working with.
I mean, what I've been hearing is a lot of confusion. So a lot of folks are, do I have to do everything specifically? Do I have to have, this team does this team does that? When really, from a policy perspective, and I've said this quite frequently in our policy building workshops, is the policy is the general rule. have a separate document that is malleable, right? That you can change to cover everything else. So that's where I kind of fall on that.
And I'll just complement that answer. So with the firms that I've talked to, it is all over the map with whether they do it enclave by enclave or try to do it at a more enterprise level, or sometimes it's tied to potentially a contract with how they're looking at it. And the one thing I do recommend is look at the cost of it, because if you're a company with 20 enclaves that needs 20 certifications, that's very different than doing an enclave environment that could serve multiple business units for managing the CUI and whatnot. What Sean just brought up was key, is because often you can have policies that could be applied and used across different enclaves. Let's say for access control and some of these, awareness and training, you've got a corporate policy in place that everybody follows, but you still might be going down an enclave approach. And when you have what's called procedures, different procedures in different parts of a distributed organization for how to implement that policy. So that's where there's going to be some variations, but it gets back to be very customer specific. I know I've talked to some companies that have done acquisitions or other things, so they have a lot of varying IT infrastructure at different locations, so they're going to have different procedures, even it ties back to the same policy. Sometimes they do have to modify policy on a location by location basis. And I know
Well,
this, yes, Sean?
in the case of acquisitions, you get it's into this kind of balancing act because you could completely refit the entire configuration to match what the enterprise does, or you could have a separate, you keep what's there because obviously each individual organization will do things their way, and then when you try to homogenize that together into an enterprise level, you run into issues. And with the procedural manuals, I make that recommendation because if I make a change to my policy, then I have to worry about, is it a big enough change that requires recertification, right? Is it still, adequate? Does it still meet the requirements? Do I have to re-up that versus, oh, it's a software change. I don't put in my policy that I use this software. I say we manage it by software reference this procedural manual. And then that procedural manual goes into those details so that that can be, like if I have two different locations for configuration management, I can say we use this general topology, formulaic approach, see config diagram AB, right? Or CD or whatever it may be for each individual configuration diagram so that you're kind of compartmentalizing the differences away from the policy itself.
Excellent feedback. I'll throw up a slide of just some useful links. Again, if you could fill out the survey as well, I appreciate that. I've got time for one more question and then we'll call it a close. So this, let me track it back down. Okay, so there's a question from when will the new revision of CMMC be released? I thought it was expected to be released in May 2021. Now, some of what I hear some of this from the AB and one of the working groups I sit on. So right now, from my understanding, when I last heard from a DoD official, is that they're saying the summer for 2021 for a CMMC update, but we don't have visibility into what that update is. I know there's been some additional government reviews of this being its first year in the program and how they're looking at it, et cetera. Um, I know from the interim rule that was published last fall, they have to answer comments on that as well, and that's under review. So what I'm hearing is that should be this summer. They're also supposed to be publishing what's called scoping guidance, which helps with scoping the system boundary and things of that nature. That's supposed to be coming out this summer. There is not, to my knowledge, a published date or deadline that the DoD is committed to, and it would likely either be coming from the DoD and then through the AB as well. Um, my personal expectation is that I don't expect CMMC levels 1 through 3 to be affected very much. Certainly, I think the controls associated with 171 will not change at all from my expectations and from what I've heard from different parts of the government as well. I don't know if you've heard anything, Sean, on your side, but that's where it's kind of a wait and see from what I understand.
Yeah, I mean, it's frustratingly opaque when things are going to be coming out. Especially, I mean, you having kind of an inside track with the AB working groups is helpful, but for the rest of us on the outside, it's frustratingly opaque.
And it can be just as frustrating for folks that are on the working group as well, because right now the DoD's there, it's pretty closely held, and when it does go back to the AB and the working groups, typically it's already announced in what they call the town halls or put out on the CMMC website as well. On the links here, I do want to call out we've got free trials available for Policy Pro as well for Certification Assistant. I kind of consider them sister applications, and definitely they work well together. We've got a partner listing as well where, you know, some of these folks are going down the C3PO path as well. And there's also the CMMC-team at exostar.com email alias that you can always use. And we've also got CMMC-policy-PP for Policy Pro at exostar.com for Policy Pro specific questions that we can triage as well. On that note, I think it's top of the hour. I'd like to wrap it up and keep us on schedule. I appreciate everybody's attendance today. Thank you for doing the poll, and please give us feedback as we go down this journey together. Thanks, everyone. Take care.